Something has fallen from the sky, and it's not just a star. No one knows where it came from, but what followed was fear, silence, and shadows. This is not just a story, it's a doorway to the unknown. So, let's begin our tale.
Section 1. Batson was sitting on one of those infernal benches common to all English seaside resorts. Long, hard contrivances built out of 1x4 battens, painted brown or green. The color never varies, the architecture seldom. The seats and backs are built without the slightest relation to the anatomy of the human figure. However, tradition has proclaimed that thus were they ever made, and thus shall they ever be. Therefore, as the proper procedure of a holiday-making Briton, he was decently enduring the discomfort of one. It was past midnight, and except for a few courting couples and himself, the esplanade was deserted. But Batson had to make the most of his fortnight of freedom. 1 week had already vanished, and in 7 days he must return to London and the musty office where he had spent 9 hours a day for the last 11 years, entering up ledgers at a salary of 35 shillings a week. By exhibiting a total disregard of his own tastes, comfort, and health, he had risen to and retained this billet. He realized his good fortune and was to a large extent contented. Nevertheless, there were moments when he sensed that life had many high roads and bypaths which offered greater value for the barter of a soul, and that was just what he was thinking as he gazed absently over the black water. The night was warm and the scene was monotonously restful. Probably in a little while he would have dozed, but fate decided that he should be one of the few to witness the arrival of the most momentous visitor this planet had ever known. It was just a flash, a streak of brilliant light, and it was gone. It came into view high over the black water, and, rushing in an arc, passed overhead, speeding inland. It appeared to him to be about equal to the size of the full moon, but as his eye followed its course, he had the impression that it had become much larger before the retina lost the impression of that lightning-like stab. "Crikey!" exclaimed Batson in an awed tone. "That's a whopper!" Once in his irresponsible youth, he was now 26 years old, he had attended a short course of lectures upon astronomy at the Polytechnic. He had been deeply interested, for in him were the seeds, though he never knew it, of that divine fire we fatuously label imagination. The monotony, the deadly poison of a meager assured sufficiency, had stifled the growth and deprived him of the energy necessary to feed it. Yet shreds of knowledge, gleams of that lost paradise remained dormant within him, and now he knew that, in a few hours, many millions would be reading of what he had been the favored observer, for he realized that this was no ordinary visitor, and a certain emotion at his own eminence in being able to discount the morning papers. They did not arrive until the 10 train, with their account of the big meteor, afforded him great satisfaction as he sauntered back to the boarding house. And that was the commencement of the strange and disastrous happenings which beset the world so shortly. Possibly a few hundred persons of the British Isles shared with him the doubtful privilege of witnessing the arrival of this unique visitor, but certainly not one had thought of the horror which it brought with it. It was a meteor, sure enough, but of enormous proportion, far and away the largest humanity has any record of, so large that it might rank as a baby planet, one of those small dark bodies with which space is thought to be profusely peppered, and which, are invisible until they get well within the grasp of our sun. Of course, on that particular morning, Batson overslept and arrived at the dining room a good 20 minutes later than his fellow boarders. They appeared to be greatly excited, and their interest was centered around a half a dozen copies of the Bright Sea Advertiser. "Here, Batson," cried an acquaintance, Dyke of Wakefield and Ruggles. "Have a squint at this. You know a bit about these things, don't you?" And he handed him the sheet, which Batson at once saw was a special, run out by the enterprising editor. Where Dyke had gleaned the knowledge of his early studies he could not say. However, he was flattered by the publicity of the appeal and the sudden arrest of the clatter as all eyes were turned in his direction. "Well, not a great deal. An amateur, you know," replied Batson modestly as he scanned the bold type and, suppressing his amazement, read, "Giant meteor falls near Romney. Diameter 300 feet. Countryside on fire. Dozen farms vanish." "Ah, I thought so," said he with deliberation. "Thought what?" queried Dykes impatiently. "That something like this would happen," said Batson, shaking his head gravely, "when I saw that big chap go sailing by last night." "You saw it? Where? What was it like?" cried a dozen eager listeners. "Oh, I happened to be out late, doing a little star charting, you know, when this great brute came swinging along. Rushing he was, big as a house, and all a mass of red flames. I guessed by the line it was going it would fall somewhere around Romney way, and I tell you I felt mighty glad I wasn't living there. It was a magnificent sight. Likely the world will never see such another. You missed something," he added in lordly regret. During the morning, the strain upon his inventive faculties was exhaustive, though a hasty scanning of the Advertiser gave him some pointers. The editor was a talented man in this direction, and had let himself go. Not often had a local sheet the chance to forestall the great dailies. These, when they arrived, were simply a mass of huge flaring headliners of the most startling nature, and the matter which they headed warranted the display, for it transpired that the descent of this unique arrival had been accompanied by a serious loss of life and destruction of property. It had apparently descended in the curve of a speeding missile a few hundred yards south of the village of Rumford. There, torn a gash in the ground 100 feet in depth and many long, and from there it had bounced like a rubber ball for a half-mile, erasing a third of the hamlet before rising clear of the balance, alighting again, dented another hole in the countryside, snuffing out a large farm in the act, and then, in decreasing leaps, had covered another 2 miles of farmland, leaving a trail of awful destruction in its wake preliminary to ceasing its activities. It now reposed, a vast, glowing, incandescent ball in the extensive Romney marshes, which, in flat, water-sogged wastes, extend into the Thames estuary. So far as a hasty survey could be accurate, over 500 persons had perished in this disastrous landing. Of this appalling number, the greater proportion had utterly vanished, and the remainder were merely charred remnants burnt to a cinder by the intense heat of the passing monster. Among these latter were the occupants of the celebrated Wivenorth Hall, the seat of 20 generations of Wivens. The direct and last representative, with his entire family, had perished, and the stately Tudor pile had, in a second, become a molten furnace in the fiery breath of the giant, as it almost brushed the walls in passing. Even now, as it lay, with 1/4 of its vast bulk buried, it was impossible to approach within a radius of a couple of miles, and already, For that space, every house, every blade of grass, and every vestige of inflammable material had been consumed. And beyond this radius, fires were hourly breaking out, the tremendous and sustained heat rapidly drying to tinder an ever-increasing area. It was estimated to be 300 to 400 feet in diameter. All London was flocking to the spot, and the railroads in that district had suspended their set schedules to send everything on wheels packed with excursionists of the vicinity. Autos, airplanes, ancient four-horse charabancs, costers with their mokes, on wings, on foot, on wheels. A vast multitude were pouring that way. Business had entirely ceased. Workers in offices, stores, factories, and docks simply laid down their tools and joined the black tide. A mania had taken possession of the populace to view this giant arrival from out of the depths of uncharted space. The impact of its first alighting had been distinctly felt in the metropolis. The severity of the blow and the tremendous crash which accompanied it were at first thought to be of a subterranean nature and occasioned much alarm. But telephonic news from the neighborhood of the descent soon set the presses whirling, and the specials broadcast the bare facts. The excitement became intense, and great crowds flocked the streets of the city. Primrose Hill and the heights at Highgate and Hampstead were black with an eager, seething mass of humanity striving to obtain a view of the monster, for it was very clearly visible from these points as a brilliant, rose-tinted, glowing disk, which threw its radiance even upon the watchers themselves and paled the star-spangled dome far beyond them. An hour before dawn, the main arteries leading to the marshes were packed tight with a jostling throng, and daylight witnessed a veritable stampede of unheard-of proportions in progress. Hour by hour, the infection of that endless, hastening stream spread to the more phlegmatic, until they, too, found the urge irresistible. London was fast emptying. Commerce had ceased as it had not ceased since the days of the Great Plague. The wildest rumors and predictions were in circulation, proclaimed and accepted with conviction. The heat would destroy the city itself. The shock had deflected the path of our planet, and we should be engulfed by the sun, and so forth. The authorities, alarmed at the total disruption of commerce, had endeavored to stem the tide by aid of police and military, but, short of actual warfare, no human efforts could prevail. For 2 days this frenzy of unreasonable curiosity raged. Then such prosaic matters as a scarcity of bread, meat, coal, and the exposure to the elements of those earlier multitudes unable to force their return asserted themselves. For the most sublime events cannot maintain their hold when confronted by hunger and exposure. In those first 2 days there was no returning. Hundreds of thousands had therefore been compelled to remain in the vicinity of the marshes, or move further abroad. But now, strong in numbers and desperation, these great masses drove their weight against the incoming stream, and slowly brought them first to a standstill and then to a retreat. Ever increasing in weight by a succession of frontal waves, retreating to save their lives, the tide turned and rolled citywards. By the third evening, London had refilled, and the great stampede was over, to be ever remembered as one of the most inexplicable manias which humanity has experienced. Section 2. A week later, men still read the morning papers with a pleased interest, noting the fresh data of the scientific bodies, minutely watching it with the complacency of parents observing the growth of their progeny. And dense throngs from all over the country still streamed to view in awe the glowing giant, which now had appreciably cooled and was in the dull red stage, although it was even yet unapproachable within half a mile. For the last few days, a providential spell of wet weather had held further conflagrations in check, and it was hoped that danger from this source was no longer to be apprehended. Batson, on his return to town, he refused to shorten his stay at Brightsea by a single day, made a Sunday excursion to the spot. He returned with his belief in the stability of our solar system badly wrecked. It certainly was an incredibly huge mass viewed on those flat marshes, and it entailed a strenuous effort of the imagination to picture the thing hurtling through space and eventually, after who could say how many years rudderless traveling, coming to rest not 30 minutes from his own doorstep. A good 300 feet it reared its visible bulk aloft. Nearly a fourth was hidden deep in the muck of the marshes. Its height, weight, and composition were already common knowledge, and, so far as the latter went, differed only in quality from a similar-sized section of our own planet, radium, gold, and nickel being largely in excess. Even on his visit 2 weeks after its descent, it was still faintly red in the daylight and distinctly luminous in the night, and the heat at half a mile was quite perceptible. "Loomy, she's a whopper, all right. To think I was the first to spot her." He dwelt for some time with much satisfaction upon the thought, though its veracity was not acknowledged by the correspondence the press received from a host of individuals with identical claims. He returned to town, a thoughtful and expanded being. He could not detach himself from the majesty and awe of that lonely flight through cold, dark, incalculable space. Expert opinion was veering to the belief, however, that this was no wanderer of lengthy, in light years, duration, but rather was it more probable that, due to some stupendous convulsion, a fragment had been torn from some distant unknown world and hurled beyond the gravitational radius of its parent, and had, under the attraction of other bodies, continued its course until, passing close to our planet, it had been captured and forced to alight. That this should be its origin entailed, of course, an almost endless chain of miracles, but then so does the daily existence of untold heavenly bodies. In its flight through the lower strata of our atmosphere, it is a certainty that it encircled our world at least once, and probably several times at a great distance. It became plastic from the intense heat generated by the friction, and, whatever its previous form, was molded into its present globular shape. This transformation would take place probably between 10 and 20 miles from the Earth's surface, or, rather, it would commence then and culminate at a somewhat lesser height. And so, having learned all that the man in the street could readily assimilate, the great common-sense public later on shelved the incident and returned to its daily menu of crime and divorce. Some 2 months after this unique landing, our friend Batson, one Sunday, was stretched full length in the shade of a patch of gorse on Hampstead Heath. It was the last week in July, and the day was so sultry that even a most atrocious and minutely detailed murder was perused by him without much satisfaction. The paper he held was one of the great weekly editions, which appear to be in wireless connection with every square mile of land and water from pole to pole. It is immaterial that he was smoking a cheap and nasty imitation Egyptian cigarette. Also, that short paragraphs invariably diverted his attention from the more stately solid columns. In one of these digressions, his eye alighted upon the following: Herzegovina, Bosnia. A most extraordinary state of panic exists in the hamlet of Gorovica, the inhabitants of which are en masse migrating. The reason being, they assert, the presence in the neighboring mountains of an unknown plant growth which is possessed of locomotory powers and predatory activities. They maintain that 2 of their number have already fallen victims to this strange vegetation, and others have had narrow escapes. While most probably the fatalities are due to entirely natural causes, exaggerated by ignorance and superstition, yet the affair has attracted considerable attention, and the authorities have instituted an investigation. Gorovica lies 35 miles northeast of the capital. The country is wild and rugged in the extreme. Education is practically non-existent. "Ignorant lot, I reckon," said Batson aloud. "Awful bosh. Queer, though, a whole village moving out. People like that don't leave home for nothing." Unaccountably, his mind reverted to that paragraph many times during the afternoon. On that very day 2 men, separated by many thousand miles, had barely escaped with their lives from dangers every whit as incredible as the item that Batson had read, and long into that night they sat, relating to wondering and sympathetic friends their strange experiences. One, a Sicilian fisherman, told with many crossings and expressions of gratitude to the saints a story of being off a long rocky point laying out his lines for the fish which at low water swarmed there. He had cast out his lines and was waiting for the turn of the tide to test the presence of the shoal, as then the catch was the most sure. Waiting, he had drowsed in the stern of the boat, drowsed until he was aroused by a gentle rustling on the outside of the craft, as though some object was passing underneath. Thinking that a porpoise might be beneath the keel, engaged in scraping off certain marine parasites, as is their occasional fashion, he leaned over the side, mildly curious. But all he could see was a mass of what he took at first to be a species of large rope-like seaweed. Yet the dull green color and stout build of the stems and fronds were unfamiliar to him, and attracted his attention. He described the fronds as being as long as his arm, and nearly as thick, widening as they left the parent stem, and with extremities which seemed to be curiously involved series of folds. There was something fleshy and morbid in their appearance, which was enhanced by their color, a dull, oily green. And as he gazed at the thick, smooth stems, a feeling of revulsion he could neither describe nor explain came upon him. For a moment he gazed wonderingly. There appeared to be a mass of it, and only around the boat. Then he became aware that it was not the ripple on the water that was imparting a semblance of movement to the growth. It was a movement originating in its own mass. The rope-like stems were slowly twisting and thrusting their visible lengths from one side to another, and the fronds, too, appeared to be alternatingly retracting and elongating, though on the whole the motion drove the mass closer to the boat. Beyond, he caught sight of 2 more similar masses, which he had not previously noted. There was something very disagreeable in the sight and proximity of this stuff. Of course, Giuseppe was merely a poor, uneducated fisherman, and could not express fully to his audience the complex mixture of curiosity and dawning distrust which possessed him at the time. But suddenly his curiosity vanished, and his distrust changed to fear, as he realized that every stem and frond were moving in toward the boat, and a great number already alongside were gently tapping and striking at the planking, even raising their convolutions above the surface to do so. It was as though they were intelligently examining the craft. Then the fisherman, thoroughly alarmed, relinquished his role of passive observer. "Madre adios! I made one quick jump for the oars, but something tripped me and I fell all in a heap to the bottom. My leg felt as though a steel trap had snapped on it. I turn my head as I fall. Then I see what it is that has hold of my leg, and I know great fear." Which, undoubtedly, he did. For from the opposite side to which he had been facing, a dull, oily green rope extended its length over the gunwale and to his leg, upon which it had taken a turn around and back on to itself. It was perhaps no more than an inch thick, but it was as rigid as a wire cable, and its grip on his leg felt like the bite of iron. 2 fronds, probably attached to this stem, had half their length above the side, and their blunt thick tips were in motion, and had opened out in a rosette shape, exposing a wide orifice encircled by a series of little discs, somewhat similar to these upon the limb of an octopus. Giuseppe was a powerfully built man, and just then a very desperate one, for he felt that the gripping cable was dragging him to the side, and at that moment another cable came softly sliding over the gunwale. By great good fortune the long heavy knife, which these men usually carry to eviscerate the larger of their catch, was lying within his reach. Without a second's thought, he seized this and, twisting round, slashed with all his strength down on the gripping length. It was likely a blow which would have severed a man's head from his body, yet he had to repeat it before he attained his release, and the greater part whipped back with a whang like a huge rubber band. 2 more lightning strokes he made at the other cable, and still another which had arisen while he was freeing himself. These invaders he sliced apart with a single stroke for each. Then, seizing the sculls, he thrust them over and pulled with all his frantic might straight out to sea. Whether this move was unexpected, or whether these injured strands had their origin all in one individual mass, and the strange thing was temporarily vanquished, Giuseppe could not say, but the fact remains that there was no further opposition to his progress. The mutilated ends he swung overboard with the tip of his knife, when he had placed a good mile between himself and the scene of the attack. This, reduced to the essentials, was the narrative of Giuseppe, fisherman of Bajaccio, Sicily. Now we turn to the strange experience of Angus McAllister, shepherd of Ardgavon in western Argyllshire. Angus, though a rigid upholder and attendant of the U.P. Church, was well known to be no stranger to the wee drap that cheers, and also inebriates. Therefore, at the Bonnie Charlie that night, while all were attentive listeners, there were many who more or less openly envied him the condition which they presumed had inspired his narrative, but others with Celtic leanings to the supernormal listened enthralled. Anyway, Angus was emphatic in his statement that the sheep might rot before he would set foot again on that ungodly hill Ben Craich. It was there that very afternoon he had been seeking some missing members of his charge. A black wild mass is Ben Craich, great precipices dropping bare and sheer to dark lonely pools, low bushes, dwarfed and ungraceful, heather and scrawny masses of unfruitful briars formed the sole vegetation to be found in all its grim 3,000 feet. Near the summit, Angus came upon a couple of the wanderers, but they were through with wandering, and they lay almost covered by a tangled mass of dried, withered-looking stems. They lay at the foot of the northern precipice, which descends in one great step right from the summit for 500 feet to the pool known as Ben's Cup. This is simply seepage held in check by a ridge of debris fallen ages gone by from above. The pool is deep but small in area, barely half an acre in extent. Along its edges, a dense growth of stunted scrub and trailing climbers secure their sustenance. Near the center of a patch of these latter lay the two animals. That they were defunct was obvious, for their hide and flesh had been stripped from their underparts, giving them a singularly shriveled, emaciated appearance. Angus was naturally both astonished and wrathful, as it was now some years since he had shot the last pair of golden eagles, and the district had been free of such marauders. Angus gave vent to several hearty Gaelic and Anglo-Saxon expletives, for all that he attended the kirk so regularly. Then a fact regarding the mutilated corpses caught his attention, and he stopped to consider its bearing upon the assassins. For the eyes in both remained untouched, and eagles, like all birds of prey, apparently regard these organs as an epicure does his lark's tongues on toast. The shepherd drew nearer and stepped into what he took, unheeding, to be simply the dead stems of a clump of brambles. As he forced his way through the tangle, it seemed to him, he thought of this afterwards, that his passage communicated a tremulous motion to the whole mass. He leaned over the nearest carcass and, using his left hand, took hold of a foreleg, intending to raise the body to examine it more closely. Then the thing happened which accounted for the condition of his coat and arm that night. As he gripped and lugged at the leg, a thin stem flicked upward and fell lightly across his wrist, and, whipping over it very perceptibly, tightened itself to form a clasping bracelet. The incident was to Angus merely the rebound of a pliant stem from his step. Impatiently he drew his hand back to free it, but his hand went back not 1/3 of the space the energy expended should have taken it, for this withered-looking stalk gave the impression of suddenly contracting into itself, and not only checked the swing of his muscle, but unmistakably commenced to draw it downward with a strong, steady pull. He stared in astonishment. A touch on his leg caused him to glance down. Several stems lay across his feet, and were coiling around his ankles, and, the motion was plainly visible, were moving in spiral fashion toward his knee. Then he knew fear, the fear which is an inexplicable horror of the unknown. He had no sort of conception or guess what this thing might be, but intuitively he knew that, unless he got clear at once, something awful would take place. He had no weapon. His thick staff he had dropped when stepping into the tangle. Underfoot, below the horrible stems, lay a rabble of sharp-edged stones, splinters from the heights above. In a frenzy, he thrust his hand recklessly between the stems and snatched up a triangular rock. The action was as instantaneous as the strike of a rattlesnake. Without a second's pause, he crashed the sharp stone down on the thing gripping his arm, heedless of injury to his person. The thing reared its bruised, blunted end as though in menace, yet it still held its grip tightly. He rained mad blows upon it, shredding his coat sleeve to ribbons, and severely cutting his arm. Suddenly it fell to the ground cut in two. Kicking and struggling with the strength of frenzy, he tore his legs free from the strands which had wound around them. With one wild leap, he had cleared the mass and was speeding up the steep slope which confined the pool on its lower side. As he reached the top, no more than 50 feet above the water, he turned and stared backward. It seemed to him that the whole clump was nearer to him and further from the water than its original position had been, and its general outline appeared more compact and raised higher above the ground. Even as he stared, a single length, slightly ahead, deliberately raised its tip a foot in the air, with a swaying sideways motion, as though something sightless was seeking some object. That was the finishing touch for Angus. With a hoarse yell of terror, he swung round and tore madly down the dangerous slope of Ben Creish. End of section 2.